Distinguished guests, dear participants, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome you at the ECPR Joint Sessions Nicosia 2018 and the official welcome ceremony. I would like to call upon Dr. Emilios Solomou, Chair of the ECPR Local Organizing Committee, for his welcome speech.
Dear Rector, President of the Council, CEO and Vice Rectors, dear Chairman of the European Consortium for Political Research, Professor Rudy Underwood, dear members of the Executive Committee of the ECPR, distinguished guests, dear participants. On behalf of the Local Organizing Committee, I welcome you all to the 46th Joint Sessions of the ECPR at the University of Nicosia. Our connection with ECPR goes years back to 2001, when the late Professor Keith Webb joined our International Relations Department and brought with him a distinguished record in the field of IR, as well as his close association with ECPR. In 2006, I had the great privilege and honor of co-organizing with him the 34th joint sessions of workshops. The experience gained was invaluable. A few months later, taking over from him as the university representative at the ECPR, I had the opportunity to get to know more about its various functions and events, and had set the goal of hosting the joint sessions of workshops once again. This has become a reality thanks to the Executive Committee of ECPR, which gave its approval. It has indeed been very pleasing when in 2016, moving to 17, the Executive Committee decided to offer us the organization and hosting of the joint workshops. We have a long tradition in the field of international relations and politics that goes back to the mid-1990s, and we are really proud to be hosting this prestigious event. We are young as a university, but are situated in a country with a long and tumultuous history. I'm certain that in your spare time, you will be able to find something that suits your interests. If history is not high in your priorities, then you can enjoy the rich Cypriot meze at one of the local tavernas. Over the last 2 years, together with my team, we have been working closely with the ECPR Central Services to put together this important event. The organization of the conference has been a collective effort that involved the Dean of the School of Law, Professor Emilianidis, the Head of the Department of Politics and Governance, Professor Theophanous, as well as the other members of the department. We would like to believe that you will find our organization of the event to your liking and your participation well worth the effort of traveling to our island. Concluding, I would like to thank the members of the Local Organizing Committee, Konstantinos Adamidis, Michalis Kondos, the student assistants, but above all, my assistant Irini Kolyandri, who actually bore the main brunt of the work involved over the past 2 years. Special thanks is also extended to Marcia Taylor, who so meticulously guided the organizational process to its completion. Thanks also goes to the Events Office, Despos Stylianou and Chriso Prodromou, the Marketing Department, as well as the Design Department. Thank you also to Easy Conferences for helping us with some of the organizational aspects. Setting up this event involves so many people that it is not easy to mention all of them by name. Last but not least, I would like to thank Professor Kevin Featherstone, who so readily accepted our invitation to deliver the 2018 Steinrocken Lecture. Dear members of the Executive Committee, dear participants, we have tried our best to organize the event in order to ensure that its proceedings will be conducted efficiently and in an atmosphere that is appropriate. We hope that we will live up to your expectations. Enjoy the conference, and perhaps you will find the opportunity and time to see some of the sites that our hospitable island, with its very rich history and traditions, has to offer. Thank you all.
Thank you, Dr. Solomou. Please welcome the Rector of the University of Nicosia, Professor Philippos Poulioutas, for his greeting.
Professor Ruti Andouiwek, Chair of the ECPR Committee, Executive Committee, Professor Kevin Featherstone, Head of the European Institute of the London School of Economics and Political Science, members of the ECPR Executive Committee, ECPR members and participants of the 2018 ECPR Joint Sessions Workshop. Welcome to the University of Nicosia. We are extremely happy and honored to be hosting the 46th ECPR Joint Sessions of Workshops, a signature annual summit in political science that brings together more than 500 scholars from every corner of the world. As the largest university in Cyprus, with a multicultural student body of more than 11,500 students, the University of Nicosia has been at the forefront in the area of international relations and political science over the years, both in Cyprus as well as in the broader region. Indeed, we aim at being the leading university on the region, on issues pertinent to the Eastern Mediterranean, both through the offering of relevant academic programs as well as through the recently launched Eastern Mediterranean Studies Initiative. I do hope that you have a chance to learn more about our university while you are here. The University of Nicosia is a firm supporter and active member of ECPR. The organization of this event for the second time in the last 12 years is indicative of our commitment in the field. Indeed, the hosting of this event fits well with one of our university's primary strategic goals, namely the internationalization of our academic institution. We are a model university committed to the European higher education area reforms and guided by our vision to build strong partnerships with universities across Europe and beyond. To this end, we already offer joint, concurrent, and double postgraduate degrees with universities from the UK, Italy, Croatia, Australia, Lithuania, Ukraine, Greece, and Austria, and currently working on offering double degrees with Russian universities. We welcome proposals for expanding our portfolio of joint research and programs, and thus I extend an open invitation to you to work with us in identifying common interests and in building stronger relationships between our universities. You will find that we are a very open-minded, entrepreneurial, and innovative university, while at the same time we set quality as our guiding principle. We are also a university that is open to all stakeholders and especially the society, an engaged university that does not merely disseminate knowledge to society, but it also engages society and the citizens to the creation of knowledge. I also hope that you have the opportunity to discover more about our country, the Republic of Cyprus, the beautiful island of the goddess Aphrodite. I encourage you to participate in the excursions and the social program to find out about the beautiful places around the island, places that combine charm and seduction, but at the same time provide a journey through our rich history dating back to 9,000 before Christ. It has been and still is a history full of turbulence, as our island has been at the crossroads of civilizations and empires. To this day, Nicosia remains the only divided capital in Europe, The ongoing Cyprus problem provides, sadly, an excellent opportunity for conflict and conflict resolution to be discussed. To this end, we also host scholars that specialize in conflict resolution. That said, we do hope that the next time we host this event, it will be in a reunified Cyprus, a republic without foreign armies and guarantor countries. And we do hope that this will be in the very near future. Dear colleagues, we are living in a globalized knowledge-based society that is dominated and transformed at an exponential pace by the fourth industrial revolution. Disruptive technologies such as artificial intelligence, machine learning, blockchain, neuroscience, and biotechnology are fundamentally changing the way we think, live, socialize, and educate ourselves. These technologies are also having and will have a great impact on politics, both at the national and international level. Therefore, if I were to suggest a topic for future workshops, in addition to that of the digital non-democracy, democracy, new pathways to participation, and the role of political institutions in the digital age, one of the 30 very important workshops that you are organizing, that would be on the mutual influence of technology and politics. With this brief address, I would like to welcome you again to our university in Cyprus. Enjoy the workshops, enjoy our country. Thank you very much.
I would like to call upon the ECPR chair, Professor Ruud Diadeweg, for his welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Solomou. Thank you, Mr. Rector. Thank you, Madam Vice Rector, and other colleagues from the University of Nicosia for gracing our opening ceremony with your presence here. And thank you, Rector, for speaking to us here. Welcome, participants, on behalf of the ECPR Executive Committee. Welcome, I should say, welcome back, because as Dr. Solomou already said, this is the second time that ECPR holds its joint sessions of workshops here in Nicosia. And it's a very select group of European universities that have hosted this event twice. And perhaps there's even a third time in the future, as the rector has just said. We are here with 29 workshops and over 480 participants using these great facilities here of the University of Nicosia. But joint sessions of workshops don't occur automatically. They don't emerge like mushrooms when the time comes. It is hard work by many people behind the scenes. There is the work by Professor De Schouwer and Professor Sroka from the Executive Committee, putting together the academic program, selecting the workshops from various proposals. There's the logistic work by Marcia Taylor and her colleagues at the ECPR Central Services. And we thank them all, but our thanks particularly are to the local organizing team, chaired by Professor Emilio Solomou, with Irini Koliandri, Dr. Konstantinos Adamides, Dr. Michailis Kondos, David Kapanadze, and Danai Ofakoglu, if I pronounced that one correctly, and their student helpers in the by now familiar red t-shirts. They have done lots of work in the past 2 years, and especially in the past month, preparing for our event here. And yesterday, when registration started, we should all be aware that was still a day of the Easter holidays here in Cyprus, and they came in to host us here and to be there when we arrived. I think that and their hard work in the past years deserves a big round of applause from us all. We're all eager for the prizes to be awarded and for the lecture to be delivered by Professor Featherstone. So the prizes will be delivered by Professor Christa Schouwer, who will present the Wieldeman Prize, and by Professor Petra Meijer, who will present the Jean Blondel PhD Prize. Professor De Schouwer, by the way, is also the new chair of ECPR from the 1st of May, so I welcome him especially. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Anderweg. And now, Professor Chris De Schouwer will present the Rudolf Wildermann Prize.
The Rudolf Wildermann Prize was established in 1997 and is awarded on an annual basis to a young scholar who presented an outstanding paper at the previous joint sessions of workshops. 17 papers were shortlisted, were nominated by workshop directors after the Nottingham joint sessions. And the jury, composed of Cas Mudde, Birgit Zauwe, Rouven Ghazan, Anna Sroka, and myself, has decided to award the 2017 Rudolf Wildermann Prize to Dorothee Riese of Leipzig University. The winning paper is entitled Negotiating Secrecy: How Parliament and Executive Debate the Possibilities and Limits of Executive Secrecy. The jury felt that Dorothee Riese's paper stood out for its original but difficult topic, and for its effective combination of theoretical depth and careful empirical analysis. In her paper, she discusses the difficult relation between democracy and secrecy. Democracy requires information to be able to travel without limits. Yet secrecy can also be required for attaining certain democratic goals, such as respect for privacy, the secrecy of the ballot, confidentiality in deliberations, or classified information in national security issues. The central question of the paper is: how can secrecy be reconciled with democracy? The paper first explores the relation in a theoretical way and concludes that there is no general rule on whether or when secrecy is legitimate. It is rather a matter of negotiation. In the second part of the paper, Dorothee analyzes debates in the German Bundestag on the degree to which secrecy is accepted and criticized in the field of public-private partnerships, where public services are provided by private actors who might want to protect their business secrets. Dorothee carefully maps the debates, demonstrates nicely how there is indeed a constant search for the balancing of different values and procedures. She also shows that secrecy can be seen both as a problem related to control mechanisms and as a necessity for achieving democratically set goals. It is a very strong paper that fully deserves the Rudolf Wildermann Prize 2017.
Thank you, Professor De Schouwer. I call upon Professor Petra Meyer to present the Jean Blondel PhD Prize.
The Jean Blondel PhD Prize was established 6 years later. You remember? So it's 2003. And is presented on an annual basis for the best thesis in politics. Previous prize winners include, for the last 5 years, Philip Kirker last year, then Jovana Michalovic-Troch, 2015, Carolina Plessia, 2014, Christian Rau, 2013, and there was a team in 2012, Didier Callewaerts and Julian Wucherfennig. 11 eligible theses were submitted and 5 nominations were shortlisted. We had extremely few theses in the last round. Normally it's the double, but they were all good. The jury awarded the 2017 Jean Blondel PhD Prize to Verena Wisthaler from University of Leicester for her thesis entitled Immigration and Collective Identity in Minority Nations, a longitudinal comparison of stateless nationalist and regionalist parties in the Basque Country, Corsica, South Tyrol, Scotland, and Wales. The judges were Mary Farrell from the University of Plymouth, Ferdinand Müller-Rommel from the University of Lüneburg, Birgit Zauwe from the University of Vienna, EC member and chairing the jury, and myself. And we were unanimous in our final choice. Verena Wisthaler's thesis evaluates stateless nationalist and regionalist parties' identity constructions between 1992 and 2012. Her focus is on all these places I've mentioned, the Basque Country, Corsica, South Tyrol, Scotland, and Wales. How do these parties construct national identity in a context of rising immigration? And do they consider migrants and diversity as an integral part of minority nations? The thesis analyzes the parties' discourses on immigration and their policies on migrant integration. The study shows that the parties take different approaches to immigration and the construction of the nation in times of rising immigration. The author convincingly explains these different approaches by carving out the specific political institutional relations between the state and the minority nation on the one hand, and the conflict-free societal relations between the minority nation and the state majority living within the minority nation on the other hand. All parties instrumentalized immigration discourse, to differentiate themselves from the national governments and to strengthen their strategic interests. The thesis has persuasive arguments in detecting a sort of instrumental nationalism which facilitates identity construction based on civic and territorial markers. This strategy allows for the inclusion of diverse immigrant groups, but at the same time, this diversity is always constructed against the central state. The ECPR offers Verena Wisthaler its congratulations on a very well-deserved achievement.
Thank you, Professor Meyer. Please welcome Professor Andreas Theophanous, Head of the Department of Governance and Politics.
Distinguished colleagues and guests, dear friends, it is with great pleasure that on behalf of the Department of Politics and Governance and the School of Law, I welcome you to this event and especially to this session with Professor Kevin Featherstone as the keynote speaker. My colleagues and I also feel proud as the University of Nicosia is hosting this important ECPR event for a second time. The topic that our distinguished guest, Professor Kevin Featherstone, will address this evening is titled From Grexit to Brexit, Understanding the Challenges to the Governance of the European Union. Indeed, this is an extremely interesting topic. We should recall that Margaret Thatcher and Britain made in the early 90s a historic decision that Britain will not join the Eurozone. Undoubtedly, Britain fulfilled all criteria to adopt the new currency. The decision of Britain was not an outcome of nationalist sentiments. British policymakers fully understood the implications of the Eurozone, that among other things, participation would have substantially reduced national economic sovereignty on fiscal and monetary affairs. Undoubtedly, they were also aware of the faulty architecture of the Eurozone. But the major causes for opting out were political. For the British, as well as for the Americans, the currency is much more than a means of exchange, a measure of value and a store of value. Furthermore, they also see the currency as a flag and as a symbol for national sovereignty. The Greek case was different. Greece could not satisfy the criteria for accession, could not live up to the rules and pillars of the Eurozone, and yet it adopted the euro. Obviously, the decision was political. It was not only a choice to leave behind the drachma with a record of devaluations from time to time. There was also a strong belief that becoming a member of the Eurozone had significant political implications, as the economic and monetary union constituted one of the most fundamental pillars of the European Union. Greek policymakers also believed that such a move, in one way or another, also entailed security implications. And how about Cyprus? Cyprus had very high expectations from the European Union, especially in relation to the Cyprus problem. The major hypothesis was that the European Union and its value system would contribute in various ways to the resolution of this problem. Within this framework, Cypriot policymakers also thought, like the mainland Greeks, that the adoption of the euro entailed, in addition to economic ramifications, political implications as well. This did not happen. Instead, on several occasions, pressure were directed toward the Greek Cypriots to accommodate Turkey, the excesses of which to the present day have been tolerated. It is also worthwhile noting that when Cyprus found itself in a deep crisis, the Troika recipe was harsh. Cypriots knew that to a great extent the structural problems were of endogenous nature, but they were also aware that there was an exogenous dimension of the crisis as well. At the time, Cypriots felt that they were used as an experiment. Furthermore, they also felt that punishment was much greater than their sins. Be that as it may, despite some degree of Euroscepticism, Cyprus remains committed to the European project. Let me take this opportunity to share with you that I had the pleasure and the privilege to meet Kevin Featherstone in the 90s, when there were very high expectations in Cyprus about the prospects of accession and its implications. Kevin Featherstone was in favor of the European project, while he knew that Britain continued to be Eurosceptic. I must note that his foresight was and is impressive. I recall very well that in his speech in our institution, about 23 years ago, with British humor, he noted that in the year 2015, the European Commissioner for Foreign Affairs, who was a Cypriot, would be negotiating the divorce of Britain and the European Union and its demand for enosis and only enosis with the United States. In other words, Kevin Featherstone predicted that Cyprus would surely join the European Union, while at the same time, he more than hinted that Britain may opt to leave the Union. Kevin Featherstone is currently head of the European Institute at the London School of Economics and Political Science, where he's the Eleftherios Venizelos Professor of Contemporary Greek Studies and Professor of European Politics. He has published widely on Greek politics and history, and on the politics of the European Union. His book, co-authored with Kenneth Tyson, The Road to Maastricht, was listed by the European Parliament as one of the 100 books on Europe to remember. He was awarded the Order of the Phoenix by the President of the Hellenic Republic in 2013. The Department of Politics and Governance and the School of Law of the University of Nicosia, and all of us here, are extremely pleased to have Professor Featherstone with us tonight, and would like to thank him for accepting our invitation to address this special session. Professor Featherstone, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Andrea, for those kind words. Thank you, Rector, thank you, Vice Rector, and the Executive Committee for your presence here this evening. I'm tempted, though, Andrea, to say that my predictions are probably best when I'm joking rather than making scientific projections. And let me warmly congratulate the organizers of the 2018 workshops here in Cyprus. What a wonderful place to have a conference. My own first experience of the ECPR joint sessions was in 1978 as a young PhD student. Let me emphasize, as a very young PhD student, okay? I found it rewarding then, and I'm sure everyone continues to do so. It's, of course, a great privilege to be asked to give the Steinrocken lecture. Can there be many political scientists in Europe who have not benefited from reading his groundbreaking work? Okay, my focus this evening is the current challenges to EU governance, and as you can see, and with apologies to Andreas, I've adjusted the title a little. I'm going to focus on two main themes. I'm going to begin by addressing the theme that I was invited to come and speak about, lessons from Grexit and Brexit, but I'm also going to talk much more about the tackling the endemic problems of EU policy delivery via domestic institutions. Now, of course, any good politics lecture acknowledges that the subject began with the Greeks. And actually, the parallels between federalism in Greek antiquity and today's European Union are much closer than you might suspect. Indeed, there are parallels in both organization and political conflicts. the model of economic integration preceding political federalism existed. Sophisticated federalist structures developed with common laws, representation by proportional representation, a sharing of economic and military resources, and even the single currency between states. It's enough to make you think you were watching the Game of Thrones on TV. There are even parallels, let me suggest, to the Grexit story. In the Hellenistic period, that is more specifically in the 180s BC, when Messenia threatened to leave the Achaean League, there was an internal revolt that led Messenia back to the negotiating table. Eventually, the League effectively cancelled the Messenian debt. We can only speculate how Yanis Varoufakis in 2015 might have felt if the same action had been taken for Greece in the Eurozone. But we might actually just pause and look at this case more closely, because it also suggests something about Brexit. Now, many of you may be aware that the British Foreign Secretary is by training a classicist. He's many things, but he's by training a classicist. And Boris Johnson might wish to consider the fates of Dinokratis. The parallels are interesting. Now, Dinokratis was the leader advocating Messenia's exit from the Achaean League. He led a campaign to oppose the application of new laws and policies on Messenia by the Achaean League. He opposed the centralizing power of Philopoemen, the strategos of the League. Instead, Dinokratis claimed that Messenia had a special relationship with the great power across the seas, Rome. This was a special relationship known only to Dinokratis. Based on his personal ties, he believed Rome would help Messenia. But sadly, Rome did not help Dinokratis. It preferred to wait and play the long game. When Messenia's exit occurred, war broke out between it and the Achaean League. With poverty and starvation spreading after its exit, soon the people rebelled against Dinokratis. They were desperate to end, as it were, the Messenian exit and re-enter the League. The League's new strategos, Lykortas, duly responded and promised Messenia that it would be treated well if it returned to the membership of the League. Lykortas, who was the strategos of the League, offered generous tax breaks to Messenia to help service the debts it had accumulated during its exclusion. The one condition that Lykortas placed for Messenia's return to the Achaean League was the immediate removal from power of Dinokratis having led the campaign. And indeed, it insisted on one other condition as well, his execution. And this duly occurred. Now, we know very little about Dinokratis, but the historian Polybius describes Dinokratis thus. Listen to these characteristics. Dinokratis was attractive and ready in conversation, versatile and friendly in society, but at the same time, he was devoted to licentious intrigue, and in public affairs and questions of policy, he was quite incapable of sustained attention or far-sighted views, of fortifying himself with well-considered arguments, or of putting them before the public. People more critical than I might feel that the parallels with the British Foreign Secretary today are rather uncanny. More deeply, perhaps, were the parallels in Greek antiquity of federal systems experiencing fundamental clashes of values. There were irreconcilable conflicts between the notion of the common or public good, kinon, and of autonomy, autonomia, and the freedom of the Greeks, eleftheria ton Elinon. These kind of arguments of clashes of values were used by the Spartans for the dissolution of the Phoenician and Corinthian federations. And Sparta gives us another interesting case of exit. Now, Sparta, as we all know, had been one of the Greek world's foremost powers, but by the 2nd century BC, it had fallen into economic and military decline. It had grudgingly joined the Achaean League, and it had never felt comfortable within it. It never felt fully identified with the Achaean League. Perhaps it's beginning to sound familiar again. So instead, Sparta allied itself with a new power, Rome, and Spartans often spoke about having a special relationship with Rome, claiming tribal descent from the same mythological figure, Heracles. But there's a historical warning here. Sparta's exit to ally with Rome meant that the Achaean League itself was overrun eventually by Rome. Well, the historical parallels may be mildly amusing, of course, but they also indicate that many of the issues faced by the European Union today are generic to federal or federalizing systems throughout history. We tend to draw comparisons with the birth of the United States, but actually the Greeks got there first, and I'll return to these generic issues a little later. The trade-offs that are inherent in deciding whether to join, stay in, or exit federal systems were faced by the Dinocrates 2,200 years ago, just as rather more recently they confronted Yanis Varoufakis in Greece and Boris Johnson in the UK. In 2015, Varoufakis promised the Greeks that they could both stay in the euro and end austerity, saying no to the bailout and remaining in the club. In the Brexit debate, Boris Johnson and his allies claimed that the UK could have easy access to the single European market without being constrained by its rules. The UK could have border-free access to the European Union without being part of a customs union, that is. And the rhetoric of Grexit and Brexit has been remarkably similar. Past national leaders have sold the country short, unpatriotic and craven, to an alien interest. The challenge now is to fight back in a united front against the European bully. We can look at the relevant quotes. On the left-hand side of the screen, we have quotations from Greece. On the right-hand side, quotations from the UK in the two campaigns, 2015 Grexit, 2016 the Brexit referendum. Believe me, Alexis Tsipras said, they will back down. In the UK, the International Trade Secretary said that negotiating Brexit would, quote, be the easiest deal in human history. The EU has imposed on Greece the status of a debt colony. The UK will be little other than the European Union vassal state. Be warned, the EU will try to bully the UK with the same tactics used against Greece. The terms laid down today are very bullying from the European Union. They are very harsh terms. And Greece has alternatives should a deal not be agreed, and no deal is better than a bad deal, said Theresa May. Now, it's in the nature of populism to set near impossible targets and then to blame the other side when they're not achieved. Again, there is a parallel in the rhetoric. Others will follow us as we exit. We'll lead a new momentum in Europe. We should be prepared to walk away, to show our strength. And believe me, they will back down. It's common sense that they will back down. If we give in, we'll be a vassal state, a colony. It's a patriotic cause we're fighting here. But they're being a bully when, that is, we're not winning. When the EU27 stay united, the us versus them conflict reinforces the original criticism. We have a circle here, a circle in which Europe cannot possibly win this rhetorical game. Well, demagogues and populists speak down the ages, of course. What Stein-Rocken would have made of the collapse today of party systems across Europe, we can only speculate. New cleavages have appeared. The old typologies are under challenge. And popular attitudes towards government and what government delivers have been recast. There is a stronger sense of social exclusion and blame focused on political leaders not delivering the goods. These are conditions that were much less relevant, of course, in Europe's golden age that Rocken himself studied. Now, we don't know much about how efficient the administrations of the Greek federal systems were 2,000 years ago, or whether in today's speak they had a policy delivery problem. Did they too adopt new public management paradigms, or were they neo-Weberian, some 2 millennia before Max Weber depicted them? We can only ponder. But the recent Eurozone bailouts have placed a spotlight on the contrasting ability of member states to deliver reforms, their implementation capacity, because they made, I've lost that, their implementation capacity. Ireland, Portugal, and Cyprus were each able to exit their bailouts, it is widely claimed, because they made the difficult adjustments. By contrast, Greece has needed 3 bailouts because it failed to reform. Well, a 101 basic political science course on Greece would establish at the outset the weaknesses, the woeful rigidities, and the inefficiencies of state institutions in today's Athens. At my last count, almost every national election in Greece for the last 3 decades has been marked by campaigns to cleanse, modernize, or reform the state administration. Today, again, almost everyone says that they're in favor of reforming the state administration of the Greek government. Perhaps that's why it doesn't happen. So what is it about the failure of the Greek state to deliver? This question led me to reread the now classic book by my former co-author, Kenneth Dyson. The State Tradition in Western Europe was originally published in 1980, and it was reissued more recently by the ECPR press. One question in my mind was whether the problems of a lack of adaptation by the European Union's periphery stemmed from their administrative cultures, their deeply ingrained norms of operation. This seemed to ring true with my experience of public bureaucracies in Greece. The instincts and norms of public servants in Athens often seem alien, inimitable to overcoming problems and finding solutions. Officials seem to take pride in their rule-based behavior, creating a tyranny of legal formalism. I took from Dyson's work on state traditions the relevance of administrative cultures. So I made various empirical tests of how well national governments in Europe perform some basic functions. Now, European Union membership requires national administrations to undertake a range of governance tasks. These tasks are now quite extensive. National governments now tax, spend, regulate on behalf of Europe. The tasks cover almost all of the classic operations of government identified by Ted Lowy many years ago. And following Lowy's classic typology, we can emphasize how national governments on behalf of the European Union are engaged in distributive action, absorbing EU structural funds, redistributive action, the collection of value-added tax revenue, and regulative efficiency, applying EU rules on public contracting. In short, they spend, tax, and regulate on behalf of Brussels. Now, trying to categorize EU member states by their administrative cultures is, of course, highly problematic. Some states show mixed historical influences. Some federal states display contrasting cultures. The autonomous regions of Spain, for example, or the Flemish and the Walloons in Belgium. In addition, post-communist states are also difficult to classify in terms of their administrative cultures. Can Estonia or Lithuania be categorized alongside Slovakia, for example? In other words, it's a minefield for any taxonomy, though a number of writers have ventured to create partial classifications. In any event, when I tested whether there was a clear pattern between member states with certain administrative cultures and their performance of their EU tasks, I found no empirical relationship. Public administration in Greece is said to emulate the French Napoleonic model, but Paris performs its EU tasks far better than Athens. Greece and Portugal also display similar cultural traditions, but they fulfill their EU tasks very differently. Other inconsistencies were apparent. Latvia and Spain had a better performance than Denmark, for example. So I found no clear evidence of the relevance of administrative culture to how member states perform their EU tasks. There were too many counter-examples. So this led me back to Dyson's work on the state tradition. More important to his concept of a state tradition was how society itself relates to the state, how it defines obligations, responsibilities to the state, the place of the citizen in relation to state authority and its resources. Now, there aren't too many state traditions that we refer to in relation to Europe's periphery. No one talks of a Balkan state tradition, for example, in the sense of Republican France or a Rechtsstaat Germany. Much more relevant is the notion of the rentier state, or Migdal's depiction of weak states being overshadowed by strong social interests. State administrations here are penetrated by wider social norms and interests that undermine or distort their ability to deliver public goods. So it may be state-society relations matter more to how governments perform than administrative culture. Indeed, when Bo Rothstein talks of the quality of government, he distinguishes institutions in terms of their impartiality in the face of social pressures, pressures for special favours, corruption, and the like. Now, this conception, of course, takes up the literatures on states in late developing economies and how they relate to the rest of society. We know there are variations in the quality of governments across EU member states. The EU Commission last December issued an unprecedented rebuke to the Polish government. Its planned judicial reforms, it said, violated the EU's founding principles. In Hungary, Viktor Orban and Fidesz, re-elected on Sunday for a rather frightening third term, have curtailed pluralism across the board in the party system, civil society, the media, culture, and the economy. The irony, of course, is that the new populist leaders often come to power claiming that the old system had endemic corruption, with former leaders corrupt and favouring their friends. The new populism, however, has created a new political economy of corruption, and one facilitated, I'm going to suggest, in part by the European Union itself. The head of Romania's anti-corruption directorate complained in February that government proposals to reform the judicial process have as their main intention to block investigations into graft and favouritism. The proposed reforms are a real assault mounted by businessmen and politicians who want to curtail the work of her anti-corruption agency, she said. In the Transparency International Index in 2016, Bulgaria, Greece, Italy, and Hungary all ranked well below Rwanda, Namibia, and Cuba. In Greece, the inefficiency of the judicial process is well known. On average, it takes almost 4.5 years for contracts to be enforced via the courts. That's 60% higher than the EU average. Similarly, the court indictment against the head of the not-so-independent National Statistical Agency in Athens, Elstat, highlighted the problem of partisan interference in state institutions. Now, each of these examples, I suggest, attest to the variation in the quality of domestic institutions across EU member states, but we can measure the quality of government more directly. Following Rothstein's conception, we can create an impartiality index for the state based on measures of the control of corruption, the extent of favoritism in public jobs and contracts, and public trust in government to operate the right way. Combining these measures seems logical and coherent. Corruption and favoritism are related in meaning, and measures of public trust test expectations that institutions will act properly in the public good. Now, this is a broader and slightly more direct set of indicators than the impartiality measures that have been used by some other authors recently. And we should note that these measures draw on different sources and that they combine surveys of both expert perceptions with public sentiment. To create the impartiality index, we have combined these three measures unweighted: control of corruption, favoritism, and public trust. EU member states show much variation in terms of the impartiality index, suggesting major contrasts in the state's autonomy from the domestic social pressures and rent-seeking behavior. The graph here shows how EU member states vary on the impartiality index. You can see that below average, the member states are exclusively from Central Europe and Southeast Europe, but including Greece and Italy. Let me also add, by the way, that the differences between groups of EU member states actually remain relatively stable over time. Now, the lowest impartiality scores are found in member states, as I say, in Central Europe and Southeast Europe, including Greece and Italy. Indeed, the only exception is Estonia, which scores slightly better than the average. Otherwise, the state's lack of social autonomy is a feature found exclusively across Central Europe and Southeast Europe. Bo Rothstein's notion of a social trap seems to be relevant here. Now, we also know there are problems in how member states deliver the EU tasks that I've been selecting for this lecture. Let's look at spending on EU structural funds and the award of public contracts. The European Court of Auditors has found serious errors in 40% of the public contracts it reviewed under the European Union's structural funds. Similarly, the European Parliament's Budget Control Committee, this last February, has expressed concern over semi-legal irregularity in the award of infrastructure contracts funded by the European Union. That is, the rules are respected, but there's an avoidance of competition. There is only one bidder for public contracts, for example, in 45% of cases in Poland and Croatia, 36% of cases in Hungary. And the European Parliament warned of EU funds being used as a cash register by oligarchs turned politicians. It cited, in particular, Andrej Babiš, the Czech Prime Minister, for numerous irregularities in obtaining subsidies for his own hotel projects. And the recent assessment of Transparency International is that EU structural funds have an eminent role in the questionable enrichment of government cronies and business oligarchs. Collecting VAT tax revenues, we can also cite reports here. In 2011, the OECD estimated that if Greece could collect VAT, social security contributions, and corporate taxes with the same efficiency as its main partners do, it could boost tax revenues by about 4.5% per year. Now, the VAT gap is the difference between the theoretical VAT liability and the collection of VAT in any country and in any year. Across all member states, this is estimated at 1.5% of the EU's GDP. A report noted that there continue to be great disparities in the performance of countries and the worst performers. The worst performers have been unable to improve their situation substantially over time. Romania, Latvia, Greece, Lithuania in particular. So now, I suggest the question is, how well does our state's impartiality hypothesis explain the variation in how member states fulfill their EU tasks? To show this, we can compare our state impartiality index with a range of alternatives. Comparing the hypothesis with the length of EU membership by member states, the level of economic development, the capacity of public administration, the complexity of the political system. Each may impact on the delivery of efficiency, regulation, and distribution by state institutions. Well, having run the regressions, the findings are generally that state impartiality is the more significant factor explaining member state performance across these EU tasks. Stronger, that is, than the length of EU membership, or the size of public administration, or the number of political constraints within the system. The one exception is that GDP is more significant than state impartiality in explaining structural fund absorption only. But impartiality actually has more consequence on absorption than does GDP. I'm not going to bore you with the regressions. Let me move on. State impartiality is also the only or the most significant factor in explaining member state variation in other areas, infringements of EU law, the quality of regulation, government efficiency, and product market regulation. So the point I'm coming to is that a type of member state is evident here, a member state that underperforms, that tests EU governance, that creates structural impediments to EU convergence and growth. The question then becomes, is the EU strengthening semi-rentier states? What I'm suggesting is that the flow of EU funds and the scope for their misallocation creates a syndrome of a state receiving EU monies and favouring cronies and oligarchs in their allocation. This reinforces vested interests, an incestuous nexus between governments and their favoured allies. It creates a protective zone. In Central Europe, my colleague Abby Innes has argued that we have witnessed the rise of political parties that preside over the continuous marketisation of the state. She depicts a model of a corporate brokerage political party that directs its strategic focus to the private sector. Governments act primarily as a broker of the state's power in the marketplace, whether expressed through privatisation, regulation, or public procurement. And these last two instruments, of course, are part of my analysis here, and both are impacted by EU provisions. Inadvertently, EU membership is serving rentierism. There is a vicious circle at play, I suggest. A tendency is created for the state administration to be inimical to reform, unable to implement effective planning, and to remain permeated and passive. As a result, the quality of government remains locked in to poor delivery, and the problem continues. Now, there's clearly an issue here about the effectiveness of EU interventions to ensure performance at the domestic level, how to support, how to monitor. There's also the matter of identifying escape. If the impediments on member state performance come from state capture by social norms and interests, how can this be tackled from either inside or outside the system? For the European Union as a whole, there's an agenda here of how it can promote convergence to the common, in the language of the ancient Greeks. Can the European Union deepen its integration and be inclusive of the EU 27? Or are these system characteristics of major differences and consequences of a lack of state impartiality defining a cleavage across the map of the European Union? An order-liberal approach that assumes states shoulder responsibility to deliver on their commitments faces the challenge of systems that cannot deliver. It's not just a matter of political will, but of institutional capacity. Penalties might address questions of a lack of will, but institutional deficiencies require support and assistance or exclusion. The European Union, thus far, has taken only ad hoc and tentative steps to offer support and assistance to member states with problems of institutional capacity. But it strikes me that this is a looming agenda and one with plenty of implications still to be explored. And if that wasn't big enough, there are also basic democratic questions here about choice and accountability. In January 2015, for example, after Syriza had come to power in Athens, the EU Commission Vice President told a press conference, "We don't change our policy according to elections." Wolfgang Schäuble made a similar comment to Yanis Varoufakis. Well, who chooses? To whom are they accountable? To put it more pejoratively, what are the limits to burden sharing? Must the Swabian housewife subsidize the Athenian pensioner, for example? Varoufakis talks of the Eurozone being blinkered to other policy solutions. Its leaders were trapped in a cage they had all built. They were boxed into a paradigm based on globalization, financialization, and neoliberalism. To Varoufakis, this is a Europe of asphyxiation within what he terms an austerity union. By contrast to Schäuble, there were certain core policy rules that all sensible governments should follow. These have an invariant quality over the economic cycle. It's not a matter of evaluating the success or failure of austerity over a particular period. Sound finances are normatively correct. It's not a matter of an empirical test of their consequences. And before we move on, let me simply note that Olaf Scholz, Schäuble's successor, told the Bundestag recently, "A German finance minister is a German finance minister." So there's a question as to how much change we may see from the new coalition in Berlin, perhaps. As Richard Bellamy and Albert Weil pointed out a few years ago, the deepening of integration in the Eurozone has in effect practically constitutionalized ordoliberalism. This is a major narrowing of what the European Union stands for, a contrast, that is, with the past accommodation of different state traditions and of various state economy models. As a political sociologist, Steinrocken surely would have been alert to the implications of this ideological distance between an EU-level paradigm and the ex-ante contours of domestic political competition across member states. Indeed, insofar as Europe narrows to such a paradigm, the obligations on member states may be too much in some cases for their state-society relations to bear. Ordoliberal approaches cannot accommodate inclusivity in the context of member state heterogeneity or of weak institutions. So my argument here is that we need to bring the sociology of the state more into the equation as an arena that indirectly facilitates or hinders EU policy delivery and adaptation. It is, I suggest, a neglected dimension of debates over EU governance. It's a structural condition that may or may not coexist with a lack of political will to comply or adapt. And this structural condition appears a relatively stable feature in a significant group of member states. Understanding the consequences of distinct state traditions and of divergent sociologies of the state for the efficiency and effectiveness of EU governance requires the perspective, of course, of a Steinrocken. At issue is the mutability of current conditions and trends. What difference does a change of leader or party make? Or do these conditions appear structural, creating a path dependency? In parallel, the European Union actions need to address populist attacks on it being impositional and unaccountable, a kind of alien other. These considerations are crucial if we're to understand better the implications of crony capitalism in Central and Southeast Europe, for example, or the problems of bailing out Greece. And so political science has as much to do to contribute to issues of convergence in the European Union, I suggest, as does economics. It's the political that are the real fundamentals. More generally, this focus impacts on a range of current debates and on the strategic options for the European Union going forward, of whether the European Union must settle for an inner or outer core Europe, of the limits to President Macron's ideas on deepening in the European Union, or of whether the only alternative is for the European Union to give itself the resources, both economic and normative, to be more inclusive and to penetrate its failing domestic systems more effectively and sensitively. As we learnt from the ancient Greeks, these are not really new dilemmas at all. We're just facing another Achaean struggle. Thank you for listening.
Well, with this very interesting, rather complex for those who are not in the field as a lecture, but we really learned a lot tonight. Thank you, Professor Featherstone. So we have come to the end of this part of the proceedings, and you are all welcome for the reception outside. Thank you.